Hello, my name is Gary Gomes. I'm here to talk with you about Vedic astrology and also a variety of related topics, but it'll be primarily Vedic astrology this week. We were talking last week about Arudas, or the last session about Aridas, and essentially those are representations of certain signs in the chart. So let's say if the Arida of the first house is in the 10th house, and it's done by a certain technique of counting in the chart. So there are a lot of these internal mechanisms in the Vedic chart which are done by simple counting. But getting back to the point, if the Arida of the first house is in the 10th house, the person is going to be extraordinarily career-oriented. So essentially their entire persona will seem to be wrapped around their career. If a person's Arida is in the second house, their entire life will be focused around money, seventh house, marriage, things like that. And that's useful information. We were also talking a little bit about nakshatras, and I promised to go into nakshatras in much more detail. Both Aridas and nakshatras are really fascinating, and there's an entire topic of what are called little planets. And little planets are mathematically calculated points in a chart. And we can also get into things like Vargas, which are harmonic charts, which allow you to focus on certain specific areas of life, like career, like spiritual path, like illnesses, like parents, like past lives. There's even what they would call a past life chart in Indian astrology. And these are all derived from the birth chart. It's really fascinating. But I'd like to focus this week, at the start of this week, I'm going to focus on another nakshatra. And we're going to focus, and it's mainly because we're going to have, I'd like to focus on another nakshatra and some changes coming up planetarily for the fall. Because right now we're in kind of a transition month. Basically, we have a lot of planets all clustered in Leo, which is a very prosperous sign. It's very rulership oriented. It's very much about sovereignty. So you can see a lot of discussions coming up around the world about nationalism, and that's been there for a while. I mean, this isn't a new phenomenon, and I actually attribute that to Saturn being in Sagittarius, because interestingly enough, at least interestingly enough to me, Jupiter is the planet which rules patriotism. Saturn is, and Ketu are in Sagittarius, which is Jupiter's sign, and it's really about loyalty. Sagittarius is about expansion, but it's also about loyalty to tradition. So let's say if you grew up within a certain culture or a certain society, Jupiter's exalted in Cancer, which is about home and hearth and the people we grew up with. So it's really, Jupiter's very, very much a traditional planet. Traditional values often involve affiliation with a tribe or a community or with a teacher. In many cultures, association with a tribe has been replaced by association with a country, because we become increasingly nationalistic since around the 18th century. Before that, it was less so, but with the advent, coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, with the advent of industrialization, national empires, and this actually started from empires as well back in the 1600s. So you had Europe essentially being a very expansive empire. So you had nation states starting to form and accumulate power. So that's actually a very Jupiterian phenomenon. One of the reasons you're seeing so much protectiveness about nationality right now is mainly because of Saturn and Ketu being in Sagittarius. And what that tends to do is it tends to take away the more expansive side of Jupiter. Saturn's kind of protective and a little bit and very tightly controlled, so it'll tend to make people more concerned with security, stability. K2 will introduce a lot of disruption into societies. The United States, for those of you who are around and for those of you who have read about the times, the United States was in a K2 Mahadasha, at least according to my reckoning and several astrologers' reckoning, in the late 60s, early 70s, when there were riots and a lot of civil unrest and threats of revolution. So essentially, Saturn K2 combination is going to make kind of a tightness, a hyper-nationalism, and K2 along with it is going to make countries fearful or suspicious of foreigners or less welcoming of foreigners. I'm not arguing either for or against that position. I'm just saying these are the astrological factors which are conditioning it. And you also have Rahu, which I'm going to talk about next, in Gemini, in a nakshatra ruled by Jupiter, which is Punarvasu, which is again a very traditional nakshatra. What's going to happen around September 15th? So this is my long lead up to what's going to happen around September 15th. Around September 15th, you'll see the sun change signs, as it normally does around that time of year. It'll change from Leo into Virgo, which is pretty much to be expected. But you'll also see Rahu change signs. So we haven't spoken that much about Rahu this week, and Rahu is essentially the planet which is connected with money, or not with money, with possessiveness, with obsession, with desire, with ambition. And it clouds our thoughts to a certain extent. It tends to make us look at possessing things above all else. It can drive people towards very spiritual paths. It's not an entirely evil planet. It's just doing its job. All these grahas or planets are just doing their jobs in the charts. But Rahu will pass into Ardra, which is its own nakshatra, away from Punarvasu, which is a Jupiterian nakshatra. It's more connected with the accumulation of wealth, solidity of the homeland, patriotism, things like that. Rahu nakshatras tend to be more attached to new and innovative ways of doing things. They usually represent great technological leaps. They also, to a certain extent, reflect a very revolutionary spirit. And that's meant both in terms of technology, because Rahu is the most technological planet. It's also the planet which worries the most because it worries it can't have things. But basically, Rahu is moving into its own sign. It's moving into Ardra, which is symbolized by a teardrop. Ardra is ruled by Rudra, who's the incarnate, or who's the representation of Shiva, which is a storm planet. So it makes people more likely to take offense, more likely to attack. The teardrop, as Rahu approaches Ardra, people will become more sensitive, more emotional, even a little bit more paranoid. And it can lead, unfortunately, to civil outbreaks. Countries that have been anticipating some kind of transition in leadership should expect to see it over the next month, and it's mainly because Rahu likes to shake things up. It likes to create panic. It feeds off panic. So you'll also see some of the market volatilities that we've been warned about over the past few months start to really spiral quite badly. And it does not necessarily mean you'll see a recession. What Rahu tends to revel in is panics or runs, and there are another couple of factors which are leading in that particular direction, and that is this month the past 2 months, we've had planets clustered in signs. And it's been my experience that whenever you have large groups of planets, and this is from looking at several recessions and several panics, the internet speculative boom, which went bust in May of 2000 when there were a bunch of planets located in Taurus. This one doesn't look as serious to me, but it does look like currency will be involved. It looks like oil and assets connected with oil will be involved, and it looks to me to a certain extent that communications will be involved. So I think a long time ago, and this is all already happening in Europe, I had predicted there would be increasing control over media sources like organizations like Facebook. That's already started in Europe. Certain of the social media platforms are being placed under greater and greater scrutiny, and that will happen as well. It will start to happen in the United States. The United States has, for the same reason we have such a strong gun lobby. That is, we have a constitutional amendment which, according to the way you interpret it, protects gun ownership. It really does depend on how you read these things. But we also have our First Amendment regards free speech. So there have been increasing controls on the internet and increasing controls on what's broadcast, and that will come under more intense light and more intense scrutiny over the next several months, really over the next roughly until around April of next year, and you'll see controls start to tighten, a lot of activity in that area. You'll also see panic in some of the markets, but that'll subside around February because of Saturn's transit into Capricorn. Things will stabilize. Some astrologers have been predicting recessions or economic downturns. I think at most what we're going to see is kind of a bubble, or kind of around November or December, kind of a panic streak, and it'll subside roughly in late January, and that's mainly because of Jupiter entering the same sign with Saturn and Ketu, causing people to get a little bit anxious about the future. We have the tariff situation developing, which is again a Saturn-Ketu conjunction, and Jupiter will tend to spread that. Jupiter as a planet makes things bigger. So while it's benefic, while it's an expansive planet, sometimes it expands things in the wrong direction, and it'll create what I would call a speculative wave. So you'll have a very jumpy and very volatile market, especially in November through mid-January. And then things will start to get a little bit less volatile, but Jupiter will be with K2 over the next year, so the market should be a little bit less robust than it has been. I don't think we're seeing, and again, keep in mind, not every bear market causes a recession, an economic recession. One of the things I had wanted to talk about this week is essentially, Rahu for individuals in Archer. Let me go back to that for a second. I apologize for jumping all over the place. Rahu in Gemini for individuals will tend to make people really, really ambitious, and they'll be frustrated when they can't achieve their goals right away. The main point to any kind of a Rahu activity is it'll bring a lot of fame, it'll bring a lot of reward initially, then it'll tend to fade off a little bit. So that doesn't mean nothing will happen, and it doesn't mean the things started during a Rahu's transit like this are doomed to failure. That's really not the case. A lot of people who attain stardom during Rahu Mahadashas, especially people in media, tend to maintain that status and stay on that particular path throughout their entire lives, because they go from Rahu to Jupiter to Saturn, and they successfully transition from Rahu to Jupiter. So Rahu is really their groundbreaking time. Jupiter is their time of when they become institutions. So I remember when the Rolling Stone, when Mick Jagger went from a Rahu Mahadasha, and the Rolling Stones were just really quite exciting, to a Jupiter Mahadasha, and they kept repeating themselves over and over again, but they were ensconced in the culture. So I hate to use that as an example, but it's the one that I'm most familiar with. And so essentially, you don't necessarily have to lose everything, but there will be frustrations, there will be oppositions, legal issues that come up when you start something when Rahu's in Ardra Nakshatra. And projects will tend to come together, but they'll also come together with a great deal of energy, a great deal of controversy. People will be saying, "What are you doing this for? This is crazy. This will never work." So for those of you who are undertaking projects during this Rahu transit, don't get discouraged. Rahu is in its own nakshatra. It'll pay off, but there will be a lot of initial opposition. There'll be a lot of frustration. There'll be a lot of do-overs, especially between September 15th and February 1st, mainly because Saturn will be aspecting Rahu, and that's kind of a nasty combination. So it'll mean a lot more work, many more delays, just people not believing you. It's a very difficult transit, but it's not impossible to weather through. The major thing to keep in mind as you're going through these next few months is, so we've seen this panic develop over the past few months. So we've had planets in Cancer and Leo, but as things start to progress through the year, the planets will start to separate from each other. They'll